the same time, also in 1999 in November, I started a group called 8-Bit Peoples along with my friend Mike Hanlon from Detroit. And 8-Bit Peoples was basically, in the way we originally envisioned it, a collective of musicians and or artists who were interested in sort of pursuing the lo-fi aesthetic, both in music and art. The first things that I was releasing through 8-Bit Peoples were a lot less chip music than what I release now. So my definition sort of changed, and my interests have sort of shifted, and I've become a little bit more of a purist and maybe a little bit more of an elitist, although I try to keep an open mind. But yeah, 8-Bit Peoples has been going for, I guess, 8 years now, and we've focused on music through a lot of our history, and we've also been involved with releasing art packs and things like that. So along with micro music, I think we did a lot to sort of shape this new era of chip music. And what we shaped it into, I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but it was unavoidable, I think. So another thing that happened around this time was the rise of the Nintendo scene, or I prefer my Square Waves unfiltered, thanks, because on the C64 you had filters which gave it a really distinct sound. And of course, the NES and the Game Boy don't have filters, and you also have a very distinct Nintendo sound. It's immediately obvious to anyone who knows a little bit about chip music when they hear a Nintendo song and when they hear a Commodore song. So this rise of the Nintendo scene was due to a couple different things. Two programs called LSDJ and Nanoloop were released, and this made Game Boy chiptunes possible. And this was also really important because of the platform choice. The Game Boy is such a ubiquitous piece of hardware. So many people have Game Boys, and not only in one area where in Europe, for example, you had a lot of people with C64s. In the US, not so many people had C64s. In Japan, not so many people had C64s. There was that sort of geographical disparity between them. But with the Game Boy, everyone fucking had a Game Boy. You had people in Europe, of course, had Game Boys. People in Japan, of course, had Game Boys. People in the US had Game Boys. So this was a platform that was ubiquitous enough across the entire globe that it brought together a global community of people that were interested in now making music using the Game Boy. And then in December of 2001, something called MCK was released by a couple of Japanese guys. And MCK is basically an application and a sound driver for writing NES music or Famicom music. And this kickstarted the NES Famicom chip music scene. There were previous options. One of them was called Nerd Tracker 2, which was released by a Swedish guy going by Bananmos. He actually released Nerd Tracker 2, which was a tracker to write NES music, at a demo party in entering it into a competition for the most useless piece of software. So that tells you a little bit maybe about the feelings at that time to chiptunes in that particular demo party. But obviously there were people that were interested in writing NES music, and to them Nerd Tracker 2 was a good option, although it has its shortcomings. For instance, the reason why MCK's release in 2001 was so important was Nerd Tracker 2 didn't even allow things like copy and paste. So it was pretty annoying to work with. And then MCK came along, and it offers up its own set of annoyances in that it's actually not a tracker. It's an application that you have to write your song in music macro language, so you're basically typing into a text file and then converting it with MCK into assembly language and then compiling the assembly into an NSF file. But it allowed copy and paste because you can copy and paste in a text file. It was also important because it was released by some of these Japanese guys, like I said, and that sort of helped to bridge the gap between Japan's chip music scene and the Western chip music scene, and that was something that was, for a long time, very separate. You had, in Japan, they were coming from that video game music origin that I talked about, and in the West, we were coming from more of the demo scene origins. So bringing them together was something that was really, basically a pretty big event for the chip music scene. Around that time also, and mostly probably because of micromusic.net, a lot of these chip music artists decided that they were going to start taking to the stage and playing live gigs, and this started happening a lot in Europe. And then around the same time in the US, I had my first gig in 2001 in New York, and I played Game Boy on stage. And I think there were maybe 10 people in the audience. But it was sort of, looking back on it, it was a really cool experience. And one of the people in the audience, I don't know if any of you know of him, his name's Corey Archangel. So that was sort of cool because Corey Archangel is an artist, and he's sort of a darling of the art scene in New York, who has put a lot of focus on hacking NES cartridges and things like that. So it sort of felt like, you know, one of those early punk gigs maybe where there are famous people in the audience, even though there's only a few of them. And then you also had, speaking of punk, in 2003, a Wired article came out written by Malcolm McLaren, who was the manager of the Sex Pistols, and he basically pronounced chip music the new 8-bit punk, and he more or less claimed that he discovered the chip music scene, but he phrased it in a way that not like, oh, there's this cool chip music scene, and I discovered it, as in I came across it, but more like, I discovered this chip music scene, and I'm presenting it up to all of you. So a lot of people within the scene didn't really take kindly to that. So there was a bit of a backlash against him. But some of the things he was referring to as punk maybe make sense, maybe don't. He was calling chip music the new punk because a lot of it had a DIY aesthetic. The tools were cheap, the sounds were cheap, things were dirty, and there was a less serious attitude in terms of not really, a lot of the artists weren't really interested in pursuing commercial goals with their music. They were just interested in doing it for the fun of it and to see what they could do with it. But in general, I think the chiptune scene rejected Malcolm McLaren's involvement. But we do probably have him to thank for an increased visibility. Well, him to thank or blame, depending on your perspective. And the rejection of him, though, as an outsider to the scene, really showed that there's a strong community present, sense of community present within the scene, and we sort of don't really appreciate people that we see as cultural vampires trying to come into the scene and latch onto it and make it their own. On the other hand, if you're someone that has a genuine interest in it and you want to learn more about it, and you come in with a sense of knowledge seeking, then there are going to be a lot of people that will be happy to help you. So, moving on. Now, trackers, tools, and tricks. So what are the trackers now that people are using? Obviously, we don't have to write in assembly language anymore. We don't have to write our own sound engines. Some of these are what I would say are probably, these are in my opinion the seminal pieces of software for their respective platforms. So on the Commodore 64 you have JCH Editor by Jens Christian Huss, I believe you pronounce it, and this is something that Commodore 64 chiptune musicians like Go280 use, and it's one of the most powerful pieces of software for composing music on the Commodore 64. On the Amiga, you have ProTracker, which is a sample-based tracker and saves to mod file format, as you know. And you also have something called AHX Tracker, which I just want to say a few words about. This is basically a ProTracker-like music editor that was designed to create C64-like synthetic tunes. So this is another example of those. This is even an earlier example of, you had the people that, you know, when they made the move to PC, they wanted to hold on to those old sounds, so they released the PC chip music discs. But then you had people that even when they moved to Amiga, they still wanted to hold on to those old sounds. So this group released Abyss Highest Experience is what AHX stands for, and it was designed to actually, create C64-like tunes on the Amiga. There's no support for sampled instruments, and you have basically an average AHX tune is about 200 bytes, or up to 5 kilobytes. All the waveforms of the C64 are supported on a triangle, sawtooth, square, and white noise. So this was a tracker that was pretty unique on the Amiga. On Atari ST, you have Music Mon 2, which has been used by a lot of the YM rockers, and a lot of, I think also used by Bodenständig 2000. On the Game Boy, you have LSDJ and Nanoloop, which I've mentioned. LSDJ is is a 4-channel tracker. Nanoloop is sort of, it's an interesting program. It's not really a tracker at all. Its interface is based on a 4x4 matrix of squares that you basically drop things down into. And yeah, it's not my style of music making, but it's something that a lot of people have done really interesting things with. Carillon Tracker, or Carillon Editor, is a tracker for the Game Boy that's specifically geared towards making Game Boy music for demos, whereas LSDJ is specifically focused on just making Game Boy music. It's actually way too CPU intensive to be used along with a demo, really. On the NES, you have Nerd Tracker 2 and MCK, which I've mentioned. You also have a relatively new tracker called FamiTracker, which is the first, what I'd call the first modern NES tracker. It runs in Windows, whereas Nerd Tracker 2 requires a DOS environment. And progress is still being made on it. The author is still working on it, and it looks really promising. It's also interesting because it actually incorporates elements of MML, which was what you use to program for MCK within the tracker. So you actually define your volume envelopes and duty cycle envelopes as MML commands. And then there's MIDI-NES, which is a cartridge that you plug into your NES, and you can basically use your NES as a synthesizer module controlled over MIDI. All of these things are basically designed to help you get the most out of your hardware. So the trackers will employ glitches in the software or in the hardware to sort of do things that the designers of the hardware never intended it to do. And then as a tracker yourself, you are also trying to figure out ways to trick people into hearing more than is actually there. So you're doing things like, we said before, creating arpeggios, so playing through 3 notes super quickly to fake the person into hearing a chord. Very common in chip music. You also are doing things like manually creating echo or delay effects. So within one channel, taking the same melody and